Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something really special. We are going to explore a deeply relational framework, one that shifts our entire understanding of neurodivergence away from clinical pathology and into the dynamic, living ecosystems that we all inhabit. For decades, the medical model has pretty much looked at individuals in total isolation, but a master's thesis by Sher Griffin proposes something radically different: the Cognitive Ecology Model. This approach asks us to stop imagining human cognition as this closed-off, broken machine and start seeing it as a living, breathing ecosystem. So let's kick things off by tossing out that old deficit-based question of what is wrong with people, and instead, let's ask this profoundly ecological question. Think about it. When someone struggles to communicate, regulate their senses, or finish a task, our traditional reflex is to look for a broken part inside them to fix, right? But the Cognitive Ecology Model, or CEM, insists that cognition is emergent. It shifts our lens from the person outward to the environment around them. We start asking, what are the sensory conditions here? What are the relational dynamics? What structural realities are shaping this person's experience right in this exact moment? To really grasp why this shift is so crucial, we kind of need to look at the historical soil we grew from, moving from those rigid medical models of the past toward the systemic awareness we're building today. Back in the 1940s, we saw the rise of the deficit discourse. Early psychiatry heavily medicalized and pathologized neurodivergent traits. Then, jumping to the 1990s, the neurodiversity movement sparked a massive, much-needed cultural shift, rightfully reframing autism and ADHD as natural human variations and fighting hard for identity affirmation and rights. But while that movement was absolutely revolutionary, it sometimes struggled to address deep, systemic complexities. And that brings us to the Cognitive Ecology Model. It builds on our past by focusing on relational and systemic emergence, acknowledging that our minds are completely inseparable from the spaces they inhabit. And that brings us to the core of this explainer, the Cognitive Ecology Model. This framework views the mind not as a static, isolated entity, but as something constantly interacting with its surrounding climate. The research highlights something really important. A person's support needs, or their so-called functioning levels, well, they aren't fixed traits. It's a pretty surprising realization for a lot of people. What we so often label as a deficit is frequently just an ecological mismatch. Think about it like this. If you see a fish struggling on land, you don't diagnose the fish with a breathing deficit, do you? No, you recognize that the environment is a total mismatch for its biology. In the old deficit model, if a person experiences executive dysfunction at work, it's viewed as their internal impairment. But the cognitive ecology model shows us that executive function literally shifts based on environmental conditions. Put someone in a noisy, unpredictable, fluorescent-lit office, and their cognitive load maxes out, while their nervous system coherence drops. But put that exact same person in a quiet, predictable, autonomous environment, and their executive functioning might suddenly thrive. Same brain, entirely different performance. Section 1. The Roots and Mycelium. Mapping the 5 layers of cognitive ecology. When we actually map out this ecosystem, we can see that barriers to recognition and support are embedded deep within these 5 layers, not inside the individual. At the individual layer, sure, we look at personal sensory and cognitive experiences. But then we zoom out to the relational layer, which dictates whether our communication styles are validated or rejected by friends and family. Then there's the institutional layer, examining how schools and workplaces either support or penalize us. Zoom out again to the cultural layer, involving the media narratives that shape what we even think neurodivergence looks like. And finally, the structural layer, encompassing overarching policies and governance. The huge takeaway here is that an individual's struggle is usually the result of recursive harm happening at one or more of these higher systemic layers. Just listen to this reflection. It perfectly captures the friction of ecological mismatch when an institutional layer, like standardized education, demands conformity over curiosity. The source material shares really profound insights from individuals who spent years feeling broken in traditional educational systems. These systems almost always prioritize linear learning, sitting perfectly still, and standardized testing. For a student whose cognition is nonlinear, who literally needs movement to regulate their nervous system, or who learns through deep associative dives rather than rote memorization, well, the school environment itself becomes an active barrier to their success. Moving on to Section 2. The high cost of masking, survival adaptation, and identity compression. When the surrounding soil is toxic or unyielding, neurodivergent individuals are forced into a survival adaptation known as masking. Now, we hear the term masking a lot these days, but this research reframes it quite dramatically. It's not just trying to fit in. It is a relentless, exhausting social translation that constantly depletes a person's cognitive energy and distances them from their authentic self. Masking involves an immense cognitive load, decoding unspoken neurotypical rules, suppressing natural communication, and carefully monitoring yourself just to appear normal. It is a forced neuroadaptive strategy. The environment demands conformity, and the individual pays the price with their own cognitive energy. Years of suppressing your natural cognition to perform neuronormativity often leads to deep identity compression and, tragically, the internalization of pathology. When you spend your entire life manually translating your existence just to make others comfortable, you start to lose track of who you actually are. The thesis notes that for many individuals, this chronic invalidation causes them to internalize their struggles. They don't see a systemic mismatch. They just look in the mirror and see themselves as broken, unreliable, or too much. Let's break down this collapse through a threshold model. Everyone has an internal capacity, a baseline of cognitive and emotional resources. But then, layered on top of that is the environmental demand, the heavy toll of masking, sensory overload, and navigating rigid institutions. When the environmental demand consistently outpaces your internal capacity, you hit what's called the threshold rupture. Burnout isn't a lack of resilience. It is a mathematical, structural outcome. It's exactly what happens when the ecosystem extracts way more than it nourishes. Now, it is absolutely vital to recognize that this threshold gets breached a lot faster depending on intersectional realities. Race, gender, and class massively compound the danger of unmasking. The research explicitly highlights that the privilege to safely unmask is not equally distributed. For Black, Brown, and Indigenous autistic individuals, direct communication might be unjustly misread as aggression, leading to surveillance rather than support. Women and non-binary folks face intense societal pressure to perform endless emotional labor, which often leads to misdiagnosis. And for lower-income individuals, failing to mask in the workplace can literally mean losing their livelihood. These intersectional amplifiers mean the environmental demand is drastically higher, severely accelerating the path to burnout. But here is a really profound flip. What if your difference is actually data? The thesis introduces a fascinating concept called exclusion feedback synpraxis, which is a bit of a mouthful. But it basically argues that when neurodivergent individuals hit a wall in our schools, clinics, or workplaces, we shouldn't view the individual as the failure. Instead, that exclusion is patterned feedback. It's like a flashing red warning light, revealing the exact design flaws of the institution. The very traits that these systems try to punish are often the exact insights we need to build better, more resilient ecologies for everyone. Which brings us to Section 3, Designing for Liberation, Cultivating a Flourishing Ecosystem. Because if the root problem is systemic, the solution simply cannot be just teaching neurodivergent people to cope better. We have to move past the concept of mere inclusion, which usually just expects neurodivergent people to assimilate anyway, and commit to a total structural redesign. Traditional inclusion often looks like keeping the exact same rigid 9-to-5 workday or standardized classroom, but tossing in a pair of noise-canceling headphones and calling it a day. It still subtly demands masking. The Cognitive Ecology Model, however, pushes for universal design from the ground up. It means building environments where authentic, unmasked expression isn't just a rare exception that requires a doctor's note, it's the expected, supported norm. So how do we actually do this? Well, by following these steps, we can cultivate systems literacy and co-create environments where cognitive diversity naturally thrives. First, we rethink social norms by valuing directness and clarity over unspoken, vague rules. Second, we totally redefine success. Instead of measuring a worker by their networking charisma or a student by how fast they finish a test, we value deep focus, mastery, and insight. And third, we actively support unmasking. We normalize fluctuating energy levels, varied communication styles, and the absolute need for nervous system coherence as fundamental human rights, not liabilities. I really want to leave you with this final question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. The Cognitive Ecology Model challenges us to stop asking how we can fix individuals to fit into broken systems. Instead, what if we spent all that energy building ecosystems where every single kind of mind has the exact soil, light, and space it needs to flourish? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today. Keep questioning the structures around you, and I'll catch you next time.